let's go ahead and get started. Threw up a poll, and this is just a simple kind of thing to get started. SIG security covers, sort of security around Spinnaker. A lot of what we deal with in the SIG is just simple things like, hey, we get an email, there's a vulnerability disclosed, or hey, we've detected some issue on the website. What does that all mean? How do we answer it? The security SIG is designed to answer some of those questions in the operational aspects of Spinnaker from a security perspective. So, simple example, we got an email the other day, hey, our build system is potentially vulnerable to a subdomain takeover. So security SIG investigated, realized, oh yeah, it's not actually an issue because one, it's an A record, it's not a C name, and it actually works on HTTPS, not HTTP, so that wasn't actually a vulnerable. We also tend to respond to GitHub issues, so we look at any security issues reported, and that can be configuration, that can be questions around the RBAC model, changes to the RBAC model. An example was there was a discussion lately around whether or not changing the permissions for the UI on who can make infrastructure changes was appropriate or not. And that went through a couple of different discussion points. Some of the other things that we'll talk about is, hey, LDAP improvements and workflows and how that performs. So the SIG covers a couple of those areas on both questions around security of Spinnaker itself, but also security of Spinnaker's tooling and infrastructure. That's the core sort of responsibility for the team, and obviously responding to GitHub issues is probably the most time consuming. So that's what the security SIG does. We're one of, obviously, the multiple SIGs. So I threw out a poll, and this is a reminder, a birds of a feather session. So it's a little bit of, hey, let's talk security and let's have a conversation around security. But to have a conversation, I'd like to know what people are looking to know about. So that can be a couple of different topics, including, hey, RBAC of Spinnaker. It can be, hey, how to use Spinnaker to, improve your security. What can it do for you? But it can also be, hey, how do we respond to those kinds of events and how do we investigate those issues? So there's a little bit of, hey, what can we answer for everybody who's attending? So I think the poll is up, so I'll let people hopefully join and ask some questions. I don't want to just sit here and randomly talk about security. Give a minute, and then I will just start picking a topic. So. Any questions on security thus far? Right now, I'm not hearing much. Anybody have anything they'd like to discuss before I pick a topic? All right, well, we can talk. Let's go ahead and start on maybe the RBAC model in Spinnaker. And again, as I said, if anybody has any questions, answers, feel free to ask. I will happily do my best to answer on any topic around security. So But let's start off with a simple hello world sort of example. Spinnaker's security in the RBAC model is really broken around in two key areas. Your account permissions, which is targeted AWS account or a targeted Docker environment, for example, or a Kubernetes cluster. And Spinnaker abstracts that into a Spinnaker name for the account. Like you could call it Bob, and that talks to EKS cluster X. When you call Spinnaker account Bob, you can set up permissions for Bob, who in there is allowed to access to read and or write to Bob. Note that these are not inherited. So if you do write but not read, they could deploy, but they wouldn't be able to tell the status of that deployment. So generally you want both read and write if you're going to allow write operations to a given cluster. So what does that actually entail? Spinnaker's permissions model is entirely group-based, role-based. It does not actually grant permissions to an individual user. So it is entirely based upon a set of groups. Groups can come from SAML, it can come from OAuth, it can come from LDAP. Spinnaker will automatically use any of the groups that you have it configured for. Now you can come in through the assertion, i.e. an OAuth claim. You can come in through a SAML assertion, or you can do an external lookup for group information to match a user ID based upon the logged in username. Those external sources are very limited in what they are, LDAP being probably one of the most common. You can do LDAP to Open LDAP, Active Directory, etc. It's spraying security frameworks under the hood. So works with the LDAP template libraries. The group information, once it's there, that is used for how you can assume or how you can assign permissions to your accounts. Now, that's just read and write accounts. That does not impact whether a user is allowed to do other operations through the UI. That only impacts whether or not they can deploy or list, say, services in a cluster. Application permissions are the other aspect of Spinnaker's RBAC model. Application permissions let people control things like, hey, apps named Bob or Jane or Foo, hey, who can read, write, or execute stages and pipelines in that given application. But just because a person can actually execute and trigger a pipeline does not mean that that pipeline can deploy to anything. So you can grant person or a team, I should say, permissions all day long, but they wouldn't actually be able to deploy anything. So what does that look like? Let me bring up a real quick demo app here, and I'll show you a simple example that we use internally. This is pretty much a basic. Let me find my screen share button here. Here's a Hello World app. Very basic Hello World app. Spinnaker, when you create a given application, an application is just an abstraction around a name. All it does is let you set things like, hey, what accounts could I use for deployment? Some basic things. But you'll also note, hey, there's some permissions. These permissions come from whatever your auth provider is. And you can configure them pretty simply. You can see up here, I can set read only, read and execute, or read, write, and execute. Execute lets you fire pipelines. Read lets you read all of it. And write actually lets you update your pipelines. Very simple permissions, but again, only impacts this application. If you don't define any permissions, you're going to get read, write, and execute permissions by default. So as a general rule, you're always going to want to set permissions. There's this handy little question mark that explains some of these there. Now, note, to use these permissions, you have to have group permissions turned on and enabled. If you don't, you're not going to get permissions. So you generally want both. Drop down, you'll note these are groups. This is actually coming from a GitHub org as an example. Basic permissions. But as said, just because you have permissions here does not grant you permissions to actually deploy an app. That comes from a very different spot. If we look, let's see if this will follow here. We document those permissions in Spinnaker.io. And if we come in here, in your setup, there is setup Spinnaker. There is a security, I'll just go security, authorization, and authentication. Authentication is just saying that you are who you are. Authorization is about whether or not, now that we know who you are, you're allowed to do anything. So when we talk about authorization, as said, SAML is there through the SAML assertion. We can do an LDAP lookup. We also support GitHub Teams, Google Groups. Any of these can be sources for group information. You can actually do LDAP or OAuth groups as well if the OAuth claim includes a role assertion as part of the claim. This page documents here the breakdown, and you can see I just mentioned, like, your application permissions are not the same as your account permissions. And as I said, it's open by default. If you don't define it, anybody can do it. So a general rule, you're going to want to set permissions. There is a super admin you can add to your fiat, which is the permission system, that lets them do anything. So you can say, hey, group, Bob is allowed to do anything in Spinnaker. It will completely bypass your permissions. Requirements we document here, and I'm not going to read through your docs. We document, some of the different permissions models and some of the things that we've just talked about. There are a couple things I do want to highlight down here. These are controls around your API. So you can always investigate by right-clicking, and you'll see 403 forbidden in your development console when it talks to the API models. So, hey, you wanted to access any given application. The API is where the permissions are managed. So your API calls are what controls it. This is very different, though, than pipeline execution. So let's come back to this here, where we set up a permission for Armory and this managed services, as an example, can read and write. When we have a pipeline, you can configure a pipeline to actually fire via an automated trigger and run as a custom permission. I don't have it configured in this environment the way I would normally do, but if we said, oh yeah, hey, every execute 5 minutes, you can set this to run as a service account. A service account is not a real user in Spinnaker. It is just an abstraction around a set of groups. Those set of groups will then be part of this automated trigger and run with those permissions. So service accounts are not actual LDAP users or end users. They're just, hey, here's a set of groups this pipeline will execute with through one of these automated triggers. If you execute a pipeline manually, it will execute with your permissions. Now, here's an interesting thing that we'll hear on occasion. And again, please feel free to speak up and ask questions on any of these. Permissions elevation. So imagine you have a change control process, i.e. you want to be able to say, oh yeah, the development teams can trigger pipelines all day long, but we don't want them to deploy to an account without the account going through a change management approval process. Normally, I would prefer not to have those kinds of manual judgments, but sometimes you have something like that. Spinnaker will also allow you to do, hey, fire these, don't set up permissions, or set a permissions that are very low level. That allows you to fire based on Docker triggers, etc. You can actually do in your manual judgment stage, you can propagate your authentication, which basically will change the permissions on follow-on stages to use the permissions of whoever approved the stage. So for example, I could say propagate permissions, and the rest of the stages, i.e. a deploy stage, if I had a deploy manifest stage, would actually use the permissions of whoever clicked the manual judgment. This lets you have one team trigger a pipeline to do like a dev deploy, for example, and then a manual judgment from a change management team to approve it for a production deploy and use different permissions. There are a couple of key factors for that. If you're going to do that, watch your write permissions on the app, because you have a potential where somebody could say, oh yeah, I'm going to change this to deploy something that was unintended. Just as a caution flag on that. So that's the rough outlines of the pipeline permissions model. Now, you're not going to see your target permissions in here, i.e. if I picked an account, like one of our internal accounts, I wouldn't see the permissions that that account is set up with. But I would only see accounts that I am authorized to access when I would come into this UI and pick this drop-down. There are APIs that let you query this and see the permissions on this, but as a general rule, you're not going to see this in here. This is going to be in your config file. So up in here, you can do it through a couple different places. I'm going to real quick bring up the documentation that we use. Operator, this is our Armory docs. I tend to like going over here. If we look at the account provider and our operator documents, you'll note like, hey, you have your different providers. Permissions, you'll have read, write, execute. And actually, I forgot create was added fairly recently, but I don't remember if it's supported for all of them. Like 8 of this, yeah, it should be on all of them. Okay, so let's take an example of, hey, your AWS permissions. You would define our permissions with read, and then underneath you could say, here are the groups. It's YAML syntax if you're using operator, and hired reference. And here, when you set up your account, so if we add down here, AWS, let me just find it here. So when you go to add your account, you can, I'm trying to find the link for where it is, and I am blind. When you're configuring these, you can set the permissions for the account from a model perspective. Here it is, write permissions, for example. And this lets you control when you add the account to Spinnaker, what permissions are set at that point. Always recommend doing one of those. If you're using an operator, it's just adding underneath these appropriate ones, the both. Now, again, the reminder is read and write. You want both because various stages will fail because they won't be able to get the status of a deployment if you do not have read permissions as well as write permissions. Now, I'll go ahead and pause there. I've gone through some examples. Any questions on the RBAC model? Anybody at all, feel free to ask. Or any other topic. Okay. Some things I will bring up. There is a new block up here, create permission, where you can actually control a permissions in a little different manner. And we actually document in a pretty good detail the different permissions. You can actually start preventing application creation. Let me find the that's policy agent. That's an Armory enterprise. Let me find the permission. Gotta love on the fly. Here it is, restrict application creation. So one of the things, and I think it's in 220, no, it's in 227. There's a permissions model, and it was in a newer version, and I'd have to go back and find the version, where you can actually restrict whether or not your users are allowed to create an application. So if you go by default, you can come up here and you can create a brand new application all day long. Now, again, that doesn't give you permissions to actually deploy anything. It just lets you create an application and put pipelines under that application. You can now, though, also restrict who can actually create applications. So there's a custom configuration for fiat. If you've ever dealt with configuring Spinnaker, you have profiles, which are basically custom overrides for any of your default settings. These are getting into the details of you have to be able to configure it directly, but you can control, for example, pretty low-level things like, oh yeah, here's Tomcat properties or Spring properties by using these. One of the things you can do, though, is with this low-level config, control who can create on a given wildcard. It's prefix-based. For example, any app named app test. You can use this to also apply to apply all, and that would, for example, prevent people from being able to create applications. There's also a specific flag on that. Highly recommend reading and understanding this permissions model, unless you want to let everybody in your company do everything. That makes work for your company. I don't want to tell you how to run that, but Spinnaker grants a great deal of flexibility on this application model. The caution is, as always, make sure you understand what you're doing, because you could either expose more than you intend, or hey, lock it down so you can't even use it. So let me make sure we link this into the chat today. Your read permissions, Marlon, and thank you for asking. You can always be cautious about it. Your read command gets you access to an account, so you can read all of your infrastructure in an account. I don't know that this particular, if I pick up an actions demo or one of our other demos, I don't know if I have one that has any infrastructure connected to it right now. This is an older environment. Oh, here, let me actually just bring up the Spinnaker app itself. I believe I've got some clusters here. Okay, so when you have read permissions to an account, you can pull like instance IDs. Now, in this particular case, there's not a lot of data here that may be relevant, but you are potentially exposing information that you may not intend. So as a rule, be cautious on it. And that's really an organization-specific question. But it is something that you do want to be cognizant of, is this clusters tab, when you get read access, grants access to this account, for example. This is like our dev account. So I can get into any of the details, including config maps or other things. Now, I wouldn't be able to, unless I had write, do modifications to that account. Any attempt would actually fail. But read permissions can expose information you may not intend. And let me link over here also the authentication model for that docs. And I will link, I believe, yeah, link the create, and then the example commands. When you go to set up any of these using Halyard, you can set the read and write permissions through that. Other questions? Anything else people would like to know? I'll answer one of my other questions that I tossed in the poll. Secrets, Spinnaker, pipeline permissions. There's a good one. Okay, let's talk about this, and we document it over here. There's two types of permissions in Spinnaker for what we call automated triggers. And if we come back here, if we remember, I had my hello world. Now, this cluster was set up with service accounts. And there's two different systems on this. So if we come into your authorization, you'll see service accounts and pipeline permissions. Both are attempting to solve the same problem. How do you control when a pipeline executes what permissions the pipeline executes with from an automated trigger? Whether that's cron, somebody did a git push, there's a new Helm chart or a Jenkins job, any of these, your pipeline permissions and your service accounts are controlling this. Now, a service account is, just as I said earlier, a wrapper around a set of groups. The trick with a service account, you have to pre-create them directly calling the internal front 50 URL. And you'll note here, hey, you post to this endpoint with the name of your service account, and you say, hey, that service account has these roles associated with it. And then you would be able to come in and pick that service account here as this run as user block. Now, there are a couple of gotchas. You're not going to be able to assign any permissions unless you are a member of all of the permissions associated with that account. Otherwise, you get into privilege escalation sort of situations. So that's service accounts. Pipeline permissions was an attempt to make this easier. It wasn't even actually visible in the docs until maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. I remember working on the docs and it's like, oh, this is awesome. Here's what this does. Pipeline permissions automatically will create a service account for you when you save a pipeline. What it instead will do is it'll change this run as user to be the roles that you have to be a member of those roles to be able to assign it that you want to run your pipeline with. Now, what does that do? As I said, when you save it, it will actually create a dedicated service account for your pipeline associated with it using a UID. Here's the good and bad to that. The good to that is it's only for your pipeline. It's only going to be used by your pipeline. The bad to it is it's only for your pipeline. You can't reuse that same permissions, pipeline permissions, anyplace else. Now there's some stuff in, I think 125, 126, where you can actually do some, and there's a couple pull requests talking about enabling reuse of some of these, so you don't have a duplicated set of permissions for multiple different pipelines. But as a general rule, up until those releases, you would have a situation where, imagine you had 10,000 different pipelines, all with the same permissions. You would end up with 10,000 service accounts that abstract each one of those. That includes a whole lot of lookups that also impacts your synchronization of permissions. So, but it makes it much simpler to configure what your pipeline will run as, with the understanding that you're still not going to know on a given target account, i.e. when you pick a deploy manifest, for example, or a deploy AWS, for example. You know, if I were targeting AWS, you're not going to know the permissions of the account you're deploying to. We don't expose that, although I believe, again, the API does expose it. So you'd have to know to look at the API to know what permissions the account is set up with. So, but I find this to be pretty useful. I like it, but it is two different models. The advantage to the service accounts is typically admins will do it and set up a set of pre-baked ones, but you're not always going to be able to assign it because you may not have the permissions to do so. Whereas with pipeline permissions, anybody can create these and then control and restrict permissions on their pipelines. Good and bad to both. It's really tied to however you want to manage these. There's an automated migration if you end up going with the pipeline permissions. It's a newer feature. There is a couple of caution flags. Here, If you have, yeah, I'll just let you read through this doc versus going through it, because there is some impact of, hey, of the roles and where, okay, you have to be a member of all the groups afterwards to be able to edit a pipeline. So if your roles change, you may have to reset some of the permissions on a pipeline on some of this stuff. So yeah, read through some of the impacts on this. There's a couple interesting ones in how it operates. Good question, though. It's a nice new feature. Not everybody wants to use that feature, though. All right, other questions? Anybody else? Visibility of Jenkins CI servers to specific users and groups. Some of the stuff supports, like your artifacts do not have, and I'm pulling from memory here, the ability to control your permissions. So when you go to your artifacts accounts up in here where you do your config artifact, like where you add a Bitbucket reference, you're not going to be able to restrict username or read groups on an artifact. You can only do it on, like if you do the Docker registry, when you add a provider for that, you can set read permissions. Well, that's DCOS. If we look at one of the other config providers, you can do it. Now, you can also do it on, if I remember right, your CI. And if we look here at like your Jenkins, you can set your read and write permissions on your CI. So any of your CI servers support it. It's your artifact triggers that you can't control the permissions on. So there is an interesting gotcha and a caution of, hey, if you set up a artifact account responding to, example, a private Helm repo, be aware that anybody in your Spinnaker can then trigger off of that prime or that Helm repo and pull your Helm artifacts. Usually not too much of an issue, but that one is one that's not really advertised as a, yeah, hey, here's the risk for it. Other questions people have on either permissions, RBAC, security of Spinnaker in general. I can talk to a couple other topics here in a minute. All right. Not hearing much other questions, so I'll talk to a couple other topics. Couple of things from the UI perspective. When you go to set up your Spinnaker UI, you can see up here, for example, I have a Spinnaker Armory IO domain. Your domain is key. When you go to set up Spinnaker, you have a UI and an API. Your UI, security, here it is. Your API and UI. UI is DEC, it's static JavaScript files. Matter of fact, you can go to any Spinnaker and you can look at it, it's just static files. It's relevant because that can impact like redirect URLs and certain other things and what features are enabled. You can go to any Spinnaker and look at those. It does not impact and store any secret data in and of itself. Your API is what controls that. So your workflow is, hey, you load the JavaScript does a call to your API layer and determines whether you're logged in, and then to do a redirect to your identity provider. The reason I mention that, you're going to get impacted by that if you do separate domains for API and UI. So do be aware of CORE's impacts on this, particularly be aware that different browsers handle things differently. You're going to want to start enabling HTTPS on those through a load balancer layer or similar. But your security block is what controls these settings, including turning on your RBAC models, i.e. authn, which is your authentication, and authz, which is your authorization. Whenever you turn those on, you're also going to want to make sure your API and UI are also secure. Spinnaker CVEs. Okay, there's been a couple of CVEs. Let's see. CVE. Trying to see if I had any of them bookmarked. Nope. Just some recent CVEs I was doing. Currently, most of the CVEs are published in Netflix security bulletins in the advisories here. We're looking at potentially moving that over into the Spinnaker repo, but in the past, this is where we have published these. I'm trying to think if this is, nope. I'd have to go back and find an example. That's Titus. Here we go. This is an example where, hey, there was a server-side request forgery on pipeline templates. This was, you can see here on Orca versions. This is published in September of this last year. I distinctly remember this one because it was tied to some of the YAML processing on templates. So Security SIG will typically announce these through the announcements distribution list. The way these will actually happen is we'll get a report of a vulnerability. We will respond internally on this. Matter of fact, there is a policy. If you go to Spinnaker issues, borrow over here. In here, we actually have a security policy. You're welcome to read through that documents, hey, what happens, how do we go through it. Ideally, the more details that are provided, the better that we can do. I do have to, what do you expect? Hey, we give credits. It's an open source. We don't really pay anybody for this, but we do issue thanks, and we've done that a couple times, when we're allowed to give credit to the reporter. So what does this happen? So the first thing is send it to security at Spinnaker.io. Security SIG is on this, and then there's some internal communications that triggers. We end up going through it. Oh, is it valid? Yes. Oh, okay, great. We need to figure out what to do, and here's the next steps, which, as you can see, is evaluating the prods. And we have a process here that goes through, hey, what is involved? How do we rank things? How do we track it, etc. Internally, as I said, we track and do some communications until we fix, and then eventually we announce it. So that's where you will see that show up in currently. And again, the security bulletins here. We'll also announce it in the security SIG channel, and we'll do it, once the release has got it fixed into the release notes. So this particular CVE, let's see if we've got the link to the CVE. It's on this advisory. I thought we created a CVE for it, but I'd have to go back and look. Yeah, I don't know that this is, there's actually, I think, a CVE Nitro for it as well on this particular one. And we announced it and released it. I said it was, we did some investigation. We discovered it was actually vulnerable. We were able to replicate it, at which point we had the teams work through identifying and mitigating a fix. If we look at this particular one, I don't even believe they mentioned it in here, but there is a render. I'll have to find the exact pull request that fixes it. Obviously, there's a lot of changes that go into some of these different releases. And actually, I think that's, I'm not even sure that's the right tag. Oh, that's, yeah, anything less than that. This particular one, it was, as I said, a YAML parsing on the, if this is the one I'm thinking it is. Yeah, template resolution functionality, where basically it would try to parse the template, and as part of that parser, it would allow it to actually use unsafe calls, i.e. load a file.read ability. So that was an interesting one to replicate, fix. It was just changing one of the internal calls to use a safe constructor versus a non-safe constructor, um, through the expression parsing. Did I answer your question there on Spinnaker CVEs? Did you have anything particular on CVEs you wanted to ask? Give me a minute to respond. So yeah, that's one of the things the SIG security does, is help coordinate efforts on those kinds of incidents, investigate them, troubleshoot them, and assist with it. So yeah, it's usually these aren't made public until the fix is out, at which point we will announce, hey, here's where the fix is. Please go update as soon as humanly possible. And if anybody wants to join, we have our regular SIG security sessions. There's not a huge amount of topics lately. There's a couple on some of the permissions model. We've been discussing some changes there. A lot of what we do is more coordination of some of the investigation and some initial triage. And then we work with some of the various teams to actually get the fixes depending on what the problem is and where. I've spent a fair bit of time with the docs myself, and answering questions versus actually requiring fixes. Although occasionally there's some areas that I'll step into more, but a lot of times some of the other teams will end up owning the fix versus the security SIG actually fixing the problems. So, but we're sort of the front lines of, hey, yeah, okay, this is a real issue, or no, that's not an issue. That's just a misunderstanding. So that's CVEs, vulnerabilities. That's some of the RBAC model. There are some nice things with that RBAC model. For example, you don't have to grant your users direct access to AWS or Kubernetes. You can use Spinnaker to mask access. Sometimes that can be good, sometimes that can be bad. That's one of the advantages, though, to using a centralized tool like Spinnaker when you have lots of different platforms. But keep in mind, Spinnaker doesn't control the RBAC in a platform. So, for example, hey, there's nothing preventing somebody from deploying a manifest that contains a service account, as long as Spinnaker has permissions to create that service account. So you do have the potential where Spinnaker can allow a user to create a backdoor. Just a caution flag again on, hey, when you go and enable an account in Spinnaker, you're granting a lot of access to it, so be aware of what you're granting. Let's see some other good questions. Anybody else have anything else they'd like to ask or hear about? I'm looking at my time here. We got about 15 minutes left. Secrets. Spinnaker does not normally recommend doing secrets inside Spinnaker. Generally that's better for sidecars or your environment injection than it is to actually use Spinnaker to do it. We don't recommend it. Just as a principle, having secrets as part of your pipelines or as part of anything you bake, don't do it. Please don't embed secrets in your code. And I consider Docker images to be code from that perspective. So the short answer for that one is, yeah, don't use it. With that said, you can use Spinnaker to deploy stuff and include like, hey, go load this environment from a target account instead of trying to do it. And Spinnaker is very intentionally not doing that. Now, there are some things that you do want to be aware of from a secret perspective. So, hey, when you go for automated triggers, do be aware, for example, hey, if you're doing pub sub or say webhook, you're going to want to add payload constraints. So imagine I set up a webhook and I said, hey, go allow Bob to configure some of these. I'm going to allow a trigger webhook Bob to fire this pipeline. Well, webhooks, as a general rule, don't have authentication. They're open to anybody who can execute it, which means if you have a webhook open to the world and you allow that webhook to trigger a deployment, you're going to get a deployment. You're going to want to add some sort of constraint or secret to enforce that your fire or your trigger is actually what you want it to happen. Particularly if you're using any part of your trigger as part of your deployment. So what can you do? Well, from a permission security perspective, each of your triggers supports a slightly different functionality. Jenkins, because of it being more of a poll model, well, you don't have as much of an issue because Spinnaker is talking to your Jenkins and pulling data from Jenkins to trigger. As a result, hey, you're trusting the remote Jenkins to operate correctly. Webhooks don't have the same thing, but what you can do with webhooks is you can add payload constraints. So you can say field X in payload must be some arbitrary string. Put something in here. Now, one caution, this value is not encrypted, which means anybody who has access to your pipeline can come read this. It's a constraint. There's a certain level of, hey, you need to make sure your app has the right permissions because anybody can come in here and see and modify this. But this is a way you can prevent webhooks from automatically firing unless the webhooks contain some sort of secret identifier. Each of the different triggers supports a slightly different thing. Hey, you have a Docker, you can control which images you fire on. If you're using Git, it actually supports Git secrets as well when you do your artifact constraints. Let's see, some of the other ones you can do. Oh, let's see. Concourse job. Hey, this is again one of those, it's an integration, so it controls it. I don't know if I have all of the configurations here, but each of them is configured a little differently. So when you set up your artifact support, there is, let me find the GitHub secret. Like you can define a, is it in here? Yeah, you can set up a GitHub webhook. You can have a secret field that you can configure. And this adds validation that this webhook happened the way you thought it was. All right. We've got 10 minutes left. I've gone through a couple of different topics there. Anybody else have other questions, things they'd like to ask, know about security, RBAC, authentication, authorization topics? Give it another minute. All right, IAM roles for authenticating with EKS clusters. Absolutely. When you configure Spinnaker, Spinnaker is going to operate within the permissions of the cloud provider you're running it in. So for example, if you're deploying it to EKS, hopefully your worker nodes, or if you have a newer one using the OIDC mapping stuff, it'll actually map a service account to an IAM role. Spinnaker will operate with that IAM role. So that means you can use EKS role assumption with EKS AWS auth config maps to access remote clusters. because Spinnaker itself, when it talks to Kubernetes, is just calling kubectl commands under the hood. So when you go through and you configure your Kubernetes manifest, and you set up, your EKS config, this contains a kubeconfig file. Your kubeconfig file, Cloud Driver will have AWS IAM Authenticator as well as the AWS CLI. I actually recommend the AWS CLI for token acquisition over the AWS IAM Authenticator. There are certain advantages to it. So do recommend using that over IAM Authenticator. But yes, it'll actually use full role assumption because literally it's just kubectl calls under the hood, and that supports all the SDKs on there. So did that answer your question, Laura? I'm not even going to try and pronounce names here. Sorry. All right. Okay, base container images for Spinnaker, Alpine, Busy, Box are updated. CVEs are one of those interesting challenges from those. Yes, like the base images is going to have a library that's out of date, but that doesn't necessarily mean Spinnaker itself is vulnerable to those. For example, I think I scanned the other day and I saw like image magic or something. I'm like, that's not even directly accessible. It's just included on the base container. So general rule is those are updated whenever people get to them. In Quark secrets, or in Quark, there is a Spinnaker Dependencies project. This defines transitive library dependencies. For example, what version of AWS or Bouncy Castle or Groovy for all the different Spinnaker services to use. So this is probably the most commonplace that gets a little out of date and does need to be updating. And you'll note here, like occasionally we've done, hey, we need a version bump because we've detected this CVE. The Docker images themselves are updated per service. So if we look at Spinnaker Gate, for example, you'll have 3 different Docker files. We look at the Docker file slim, it's on Alpine 3.11. We probably need to bump this. It doesn't happen as often as we probably should, unfortunately. I would encourage pull requests and testing. The more we improve this and the more contributions we get, the better on that. So, yeah, unfortunately, some of these are not updated as often as it would be ideal. CVEs in these images, though, are not tracked currently. The security SIG has been talking about security scanning some of these. It has not been implemented any place at this point. We've actually just talking about using one of the off-the-shelf. Since these are all open source, we can actually use GitHub's native security scanning for some of this stuff. So, unfortunately, Matthew, short answer is, yeah, it's not actually being tracked, monitored, or updated automatically. Because a lot of times these don't actually trigger vulnerabilities in Spinnaker themselves. It's just they're out of date and they need to keep up to date, and they're using libraries that have vulnerabilities in them potentially. That's one of those balance acts between libraries with CVEs versus the use of the libraries. So keeping up to date on any of that stuff is a very challenging process. So other questions: predefined webhook stages that require base 64 encoded data. And Matthew, please let me know if I answered your question on the CVEs. And I said, do recommend pull requests on both of these. This one, the gotcha with updating some of these libraries, by the way, there's so much interdependencies on some of these, particularly the Spring in some of the OKHTTP libraries, that you have to be really sensitive. Like I've tested a couple with Spring security changes that just did not work for a lot of services because even though Spring says they're compliant, it's, yeah, they're not always compliant with each other. I.e., I've seen, oh yeah, I bumped Spring security from 5.2 3 to 5.2.4, not that those are real numbers, and things broke even though it was supposed to be a patch version bump. So Armory, just have to throw a little thing there. That's one of the things we struggle with on a fairly regular basis, is trying to manage some of those versions and keep those up to date. And yeah, Netflix has their own sort of extensions on top of it as well. So yeah, it's a challenge. And trying to get those to compile and work is an equally hard challenge. Back to the other QA, predefined webhook stages, that base64 encoded secrets. So I said, I strongly encourage you not to use secrets in that. I don't know that I have a good answer for you, Nate, on that I can discuss in the 3 minutes that I think we got left on this session. It's probably a topic that'd be a good blog post for the future. So yeah, I think I'll delay that one for now, but don't, as much as possible, use secrets, and instead use environment injected or sidecars to reference secrets through a secret provider. So for an example, you would want to use AWS Secrets Manager, Vaults, one of the various platform secret injection libraries to reference a secret versus having it as part of your environment. Very powerful tools. I always recommend that. If you have to inject a secret for whatever reason, I would step back and say, okay, is there something we're really doing correct there? With that said, Spinnaker is not always the best on how it handles secrets, and that's a really challenging topic. So yeah, that's the general rule, is if you can, have it as a separate system that pulls secrets through an environment and uses, like, hey, automatic secret rotation. Vault's got a pretty good sidecar implementation that I really like. And you can use IAM and Kate's authentication with that, for example. And that lets you dynamically inject secrets versus embedding them into your platform. The rule is never embed secrets. So I think I've got 1 minute left, but I think that's about it on that. Security, it's an ongoing thing. Pay attention to it, understand there's a lot of flexibility in the platform. And anytime you have that much flexibility, you can also shoot yourself in the foot really easily. So, depending on your environment, depending on your regulations, it's definitely something to pay a significant amount of attention to and understand the good and the bad. A lot of options on this. Always encourage enable it, turn it on. And please come to the SIG, welcome assistance, triaging, pull requests, etc. There's some very interesting ones going on in Fiat from a performance perspective. And I also got to thank the rest of the community for their support on that. With that said, thank you all for coming, and hope this was useful for everybody.